Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining this third of three conversations that we've had that we've titled The Origins of Chronic Disease. Our goal here, as we've said before, is to try to make the case that the development of chronic disease is somewhat predictable, and just as importantly, that we can propose a framework for how that happens. And so, on our first conversation, we talked about the role of our biology, the role of lifestyle medicine in particular in terms of disease outcomes. And we made the case that actually the scale of impact is quite large. We talked in our second conversation about what we termed ecology, and we really focused on environmental exposures and environmental medicine. And again, we made the case that the scope of impact is quite large. Today, we're going to try to bring that all home and bring it full circle with our conversation around our biography. That's our psychosocial environment, our life experiences, the sorts of things that, frankly, were ignored in medicine for far too long and can't be ignored because, as you'll see, we'll make the case, the scale of impact, once again, is quite large. And so, broadly speaking, we really want to make sure that we cover this topic as thoroughly as possible. So we'll spend a little bit of time introducing it. Then I'll pass to my colleague, Dr. Peter Bongiorno, to talk about chronic stress, stress physiology, the role of trauma in health outcomes, which I'll set up for us a little bit in a moment. And then I'll have an opportunity to talk about connection and the corollary to that being disconnection and disconnection from nature and purpose and people being a potential driver of disease outcomes. So we'll spend a little bit of time then closing, and I really hope that by the end of this, you'll understand not only how important this conversation is, but that we have to consider all three parts of why people get sick. And I'm not doing this alone. We've got a wonderful team at Atria in terms of our integrative health department. You already heard from Dr. Medea Noveladze. You'll be hearing again from Dr. Peter Bongiorno and our wonderful Dr. Michael Scott out on the West Coast. So we've got a small but mighty team, and we all came here with a really specific purpose in mind. We came here because we couldn't accomplish at our own practices what we feel we can accomplish at Atria and what we're on a mission to do, which is change the conversation from just what's happening to a body and what's wrong to understanding the underlying causes, the root causes of why people get sick. As an organization, we're deeply focused on defining a new gold standard in preventative care and preventative medicine. And so these conversations that we're having today focused on our biography is very much a big part of that journey. And I hope, again, we'll make the case for why. We have these six core beliefs that we attempt to stay grounded in every conversation we have with a member. We really believe as an integrative health team in this concept of the innate healing capacity of the body. We believe our body has a capacity for repair and recovery if given the right opportunity to do so. And still, we practice on an N of one basis. We believe in this idea of biochemical individuality. Everything has to be truly personalized for our unique biochemistry and physiology. We spent a lot of time expanding on this idea of the exposome and human vulnerability and resilience, which I hope we made the case pretty strongly. There's a lot of man-made substances out there that can drive disease, and we believe that those substances are guilty until proven innocent. So we spent some time talking about that. What we're focusing on today is the last three core beliefs that we've covered. This idea of mind-body integration, nothing happens in a vacuum. This idea of intraconnectedness, everything that happens in our complex adaptive system of a body impacts everything else that happens in our bodies, and then interconnectedness, which is a concept we'll talk a little bit more about later. We can't do it alone. We evolve to be in community, and being in community is core to that. So in this three-part series, again, we're attempting to be comprehensive. We're really trying to answer this fundamental question: why do we get sick? When it comes to our biography, we have two core questions that we ask ourselves as we work with each and every person. What is this person's personal story around health and healing? And is there current stress or prior trauma which makes that difficult to accomplish? And in many ways, to continue to use this language, our biography becomes our biology. When we consider what our life experiences were, when we consider what happened to us, and we put that through the lens of our environment, which we'll be talking about more today, we have to consider, did this body, did this biology develop a chronic disease as a result of those life experiences? We would make the case that the data is strong enough to say that not only is it possible, but frankly, it's probably contributing for each and every one of us because none of us live in a vacuum. In fact, we'll make the case that that's not healthy to do anyway. Chronic disease progresses again in a predictable way. We've we've proposed this framework in the past that when a body is exposed to stress or strain, repair mechanisms are activated. Today, as we focus in on our biography, we'll make the case actually that that's sort of a two-hit phenomenon when it comes to stress and trauma. First of all, our nervous system capacity for whatever it's dealing with in the moment has to be exceeded, and the environment within which that happens has to be insufficient to help us deal with that. So we have to have the right psychosocial environment to support our needs. And if that's not met, that's when our body, our biology has to kick in and try to repair and try to protect us. Normally, that happens in a way that brings us back into dynamic homeostasis, and daily life sends us round and round on that circle. However, when those capacities are exceeded, physical symptoms develop. These physical symptoms are something we can pay attention to map in the body, and we'll talk about how that happens in the body as a result of trauma. But when those physical symptoms become maladaptive, chronic disease develops. Ideally, medical intervention brings us back into that dynamic homeostasis. And again, round and round we go. The earlier we intervene in that process, in the progression of chronic disease, the healthier we are. And so that's our goal here in the integrative health program. Now, the scale of what we're talking about here is quite large. This was a fascinating study that looked at over 150,000 people. And they looked at early life childhood experiences, and they compared those who had no or mild traumatic experiences to those who had moderate or severe traumatic experiences. And what they found is as adults later in life, anxiety more than doubled, depression more than doubled. We had a 10% increased risk of cancer, heart disease, COPD increases by 45%. Similarly, metabolic syndromes like diabetes, increased risk of stroke. The scale of what we're talking about is massive. And the question, though, is why? Why would a body manifest disease as a result of trauma? Well, there's a whole field of psychoneuroimmunology that would attempt to answer that question. And this is a really useful review paper that looked at three core areas where stress and trauma impact our biology and our biochemistry. We have nervous system dysregulation, our autonomic nervous system, that fight or flight response, the sympathetic and parasympathetic balance that we all strive for, gets deeply dysregulated. Our fear centers in our amygdala in the brain are impacted. Our memory centers in our hippocampus and our reasoning centers and executive functioning centers in our prefrontal cortex are impacted. On a hormonal level or on an endocrine level, you might be surprised to hear that diabetes would result from stress and trauma. Well, you shouldn't be. We'll make the case soon, but insulin resistance and leptin resistance develops. We develop cortisol changes and glucocorticoid resistance. We have impacts on our blood pressure and our kidneys and our hearts through the renin-angiotensin system. We also have cellular impacts. Inflammation, the core driver of most chronic diseases, goes up. Oxidative stress goes up, and mitochondria, you might remember the mitochondria, the energy powerhouse of every cell, deeply impacted by those environmental exposures we talked about, also gets deeply impacted by stress and by trauma. This isn't a new concept. The Body Keeps the Score is a book that came out in 2014, but Bessel van der Kolk was writing and making the case for this since the mid-90s. Ancient traditions and wisdoms understood what we're talking about here today. When we experience trauma, there's a failure of conscious awareness when it comes to our memory, what we call declarative memory. When we don't have declarative memory to try to draw a straight line, it becomes very difficult to extinguish that memory. And that memory lands in and launches changes to our physiology and our biochemistry. Our nervous system gets activated. We produce stress hormones almost as if we're still in front of that threat. That response doesn't necessarily change if we change our mind about it, or if we think about or we talk about our experiences. Though there are values to certain types of talk therapy, we need to think about this on a body level. These experiences often map on a somatosensory level in terms of how we see the world and how we experience our bodies. And so the way to deal with that is through the language of the body and through symptoms that might manifest when a patient might come to the doctor. And this might sound a little bit grandiose to say that the body can get stuck in trauma, but the concept of tonic immobility, intensive motor inhibition, is not something that's unusual in the literature. In a normal situation, when we're exposed to inescapable threat, our body can go into a freeze response. That's not very surprising. We see it in animals, we see it in ourselves. We've probably experienced it in ourselves if we've been exposed to the right circumstances. What post-traumatic stress differentiates, though, is the fact that we can continue to re-experience that trauma when we're faced with that actual threat or even when we're not. And so there was an interesting study that looked at individuals who were exposed to trauma, and they broke the group down into those with PTSD and those without PTSD. And they hooked people up to postural assessments and EKGs. And what they found was body sway changes. Our body freezes, our muscle fibers stop firing, our heart rate variability and our heart rate go in opposite directions from what would look like a healthy EKG. Effectively, when people are given the opportunity to hear about their own traumas, those with PTSD re-experience that trauma every single time. We would make the case that we think about our life experiences, our past experiences often. And so this idea of being in freeze and disassociation, which we see in a lot of our patients, very much is grounded in the physiology and our understanding of the nervous system. And unfortunately, that becomes a vicious cycle. In the wrong setting, we become primed to see the world as dangerous. If we have especially early life traumatic events, our threat perception changes. We increase this idea of the false positive bias. It is more dangerous to think that a bear is running at us and be wrong than the opposite, right? It's better to assume that there's a bear and there not be a bear and activate our stress response in our physiology, as opposed to assuming that there is no bear and that we're safe when there actually is one. This propensity to see the world in this way increases our risk of all kinds of mental health disorders and now predisposes us to additional trauma. So in the wrong body, in the wrong environment, this can become a bit of a vicious cycle. And much like we talked about with our environmental exposures, the human body is resilient, and a vast, vast majority of people do not develop PTSD, even when they're exposed to inescapable threat and really life-altering conditions. In fact, most people experience something called post-traumatic growth, which we don't hear about so often. When we survive something difficult, our nervous system has the capacity to not only recover, but learn from those experiences. And so we're really curious about why some people develop PTSD and why some people don't. What the data says is that by about 3 months, 20% of people will have recovered and been in remission from post-traumatic stress. By 6 months, it's 27%. The median recovery timeline for people is about 14 years, believe it or not. And by over the course of a lifetime, 92% of people tend to recover from PTSD. What is different about the people who recover quickly in those first 3 months? What's different about the people who never recover and their lives are never the same? This is some of what we're talking about today and trying to expand upon. And really, if we're going to be comprehensive in our work, we have to look at the animal kingdom. We have to think about our physiology being unaffected by our thoughts and our thought patterns. What does it look like when our body wants to respond? And if we look at the animal kingdom, if you've ever seen two dogs getting into a stressful altercation, they'll shake things off within 30 seconds and they move on. Same thing, these ducks on a pond will flap their wings after a fight and simply move on. They do not develop PTSD. This is work that I first heard about from Dr. Peter Levine. He wrote a really fascinating book called Waking the Tiger, presenting a framework for development of a treatment program that he called somatic experiencing that really looked at creating the circumstances for healing that would allow people to move through stress and move through trauma in a way that didn't allow them to be deeply, deeply impacted. And so when we experience a traumatic event, the right circumstances can be available over the course of seconds or over the course of years. When we experience something difficult or stressful, the very first thing we have to do is establish that we're safe and that we're okay. In fact, our bodies' number one job and number one mission is to bring us to safety. So, did I survive? If that's true, if we can be clear about that, we have to have the opportunity then to explore and accept sensation. What is happening in my body right now? Can I be aware of my physiology right now? Shining that light of awareness on our physiology actually allows it to move through difficult situations more readily. Once we've had that opportunity to do it, we have to reestablish what we call defensive responses. What do I need to do now to get myself to true safety? That allows us to move to a next step, which is to move in the direction of that dynamic homeostasis that we talked about. We have to engage our ability to self-regulate. Nothing is good or bad, it's about how we regulate to the environment. And then a final step is to reestablish our capacity for social engagement. Who do I connect with now? How do I make sure that I'm not alone in dealing with this? Now, again, that can happen within seconds if we have the right awareness and support system. Or if that capacity is exceeded, we need the right support network and we need the right mental health providers to move us in that direction. So that's a really important framework with which I want you to hear everything else that we talk about today. And so now I'm excited to pass it to Dr. Peter Bongiorno.
All right, so chronic stress and trauma. We're in the biography section. So this is my dog, Elon, spelled Elan, and it means with elegance. So my daughter and I really like that name and that word. And Elon spends a lot of time on this couch, and he spends a lot of time relaxing. Probably something we'd like to do most of the day, right? And every once in a while, he'll see a squirrel and he might chase it or bark at a cat outside the window or something like that. And his adrenals get all excited and he does what he does. And then he kind of goes back and he goes back to sleep a little bit. And that's what animals typically do. There's parts of the day where they're a little bit excited and they use their adrenal glands and put out some epinephrine and put out some adrenaline. And then at one point, they go back. And so most of the day is pretty calm. So this is a representation of most of us humans, running around, trying to beat the clock, a lot of things going on. Our prefrontal cortex is thinking about 20 things at the same time, thinking we could probably handle 30 things at the same time, when in reality we could probably handle two or three at the same time. And it's really stressful for our bodies, right? It's arguably we're not really made to live this way, to be doing all the things we're doing, all the responsibilities we have. It's really no different, than running from a bear, right? So let's talk about the definitions of stress, trauma, and distress. Let's go through some of the nomenclature. So stress is a normal reaction to external pressures that fade as the situation resolves. So most of the time, when we go through something slightly difficult, um, we get stressed and it tends to go away. So stress technically is our reaction to an external pressure. Trauma is a lingering, overwhelming response to a deeply distressing event with a loss of feeling safe. So, and that's really important, this idea that it's lingering, it's a little deeper than a normal stressor, and then we stop feeling safe. And that's a great question, right? To ask ourselves and to ask other people around us, do you feel safe? Because sometimes it's not just physically safe, it's emotionally safe. Like when you lose a loved one and a person just doesn't feel safe, anymore. And then there's distress, aversive negative state in which coping and adaptation processes fail to return an organism to physiological and or psychological homeostasis. So now we're at a point where this trauma or this external pressure has become a situation where now the body was responding for a while and now it's just not really responding well anymore and it's kind of decompensating. So that's what happens, right? When the bear comes at us, we get our body stresses, right? We fight or we run. Our heart beats really hard and fast, and because we're going to try to run from the bear, we're going to try to fight the bear. Circulation goes to our muscles, it goes to our eyes, it goes to our brain, so we could think quickly and listen and move fast. And circulation goes away from our gut. It goes away from other organs of the body, like the reproductive system, because those aren't needed right now. We're not going to be thinking about any kind of sexual activity. We're not going to be thinking about sitting down and eating a meal when we're running from a bear. So in the short term, those systems do poorly because we're giving our energy to the part of our bodies that are going to help us survive. Works great in the short term, but when we get into that trauma and that really distress situation, then our bodies can't continue on like that. So when we talk about stress physiology, we have to think first about Hans Selye. So this is there's an article from Nature which came out in July of 1936, and he wrote this 74-line piece about the general adaptation syndrome, and he described really stress and distress in these terms, right? The first step was an alarm phase where we first get scared and we have this momentary decrease in abilities, but then our stress system really kicks off and it sends out cortisol and it sends out norepinephrine and epinephrine and we respond to the stress. And then as if the stress continues to go on, our bodies start to make changes and it starts to kind of handle what seems to be a longer term problem, right? Maybe the bear keeps running after us. We can't find a tree to get away from that bear, so we kind of just keep running. And then we get to the exhaustion phase where the stress has gone on for so long that now our bodies just really can't handle it anymore. And we start to fatigue and we start to fade. So that was Hans Selye, right? I talk about in my book a bit about how chronic stress can contribute to inflammation. Inflammation, when there's a lot of inflammation around, especially in the brain, how tryptophan doesn't really convert to serotonin, and then that can increase hypothalamic activity, and we end up with more corticotropin releasing hormone, which goes to the anterior pituitary, which contributes to more ACTH production, which eventually communicates with the adrenal glands to make a lot of cortisol. Now, that happens in the short term, and that's a good thing, right? Because in the short term, you don't want your serotonin high, you want it low because you don't want to be happy in the moment. You want to be fearful and you want to be afraid and you want to run from that bear and make the right decisions to save your life. The problem is when this continues on and on indefinitely, as cortisol goes up, then we end up becoming fatigued. We have sleep problems. We don't enjoy the things we used to enjoy. Our appetite can go down. Some people, it actually goes way up. And inflammation increases and increases. And that chronic stress can start in the womb, right? When you're a baby in your mom's womb, it could start in childhood, as Rob talked about with the early life stress. And it can certainly be there as an adolescent, as a teen, as an adult. I also talk about how the stress system doesn't affect just the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. It also affects all the other systems in our body. And here's three systems. It certainly affects the thyroid, and it'll create changes in thyroid function that'll allow for more hypothyroidism, also allow for more autoimmune thyroiditis. It'll affect the GI tract, of course, because when the GI tract shuts down, so we could send energy to other parts of our body, we end up not making the enzymes we need to make, not making the secretions to break down our food. Our digestion becomes poor, our absorption becomes poor. Many people have increase in colonic motility, and you'll see they'll end up with diarrhea. You hear when people get stressed out. There's like this flush that happens, and gastric motility goes down. We're just not digesting well, and many people end up with a lot of constipation as well. Um, and and issues with the gut are going to contribute to more inflammation because most of our immune system is in the gut. So when there's trouble and imbalance in there, inflammation tends to develop not only in the gut, but then globally throughout the body. So, and then the female axis, the HPG, the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis also gets affected because when you're running from a bear, you're not going to be thinking about having a baby, right? It's not a safe environment. So that system is going to want to shut down as well. So many people that I've seen in my practice who are looking at infertility issues, and yet their lab tests are perfect. And they don't understand why they're having trouble with fertility. And it really comes down to this HPG axis being suppressed because of stress. And it's just interesting that when couples in that situation either start doing relaxation work and or actually start giving up on having a child, then that's when they conceive. And many practitioners who do what we do here have seen that over and over and over. So Crusoe syndrome, in the 1990s, I did research at the National Institutes of Health and the Clinical Neuroendocrinology Institute. And one of the institutes next to us, the Endocrinology Institute, was a fellow named George Crusoe, who we did a lot of work with. Our lab and his lab shared a lot of information and worked together. And he actually elucidated this idea of primary generalized glucocorticoid resistance syndrome. And this was in probably the mid 90s. And he talked about this idea of hyperactive hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, as we talked about, increases cortisol levels, and when cortisol levels stay very high for quite a while, weeks, months, then we start to see what's called glucocorticoid resistance, or basically the receptors for this cortisol starts to actually internalize because it's almost like I've heard it described as like if you yell at somebody over and over, after a while they stop listening to you, right? And that's what happens in the body. When cortisol is constantly up and up and up, the body stops listening to it in an attempt to rebalance. And when you have this glucocorticoid resistance, there's going to be more physical and mental symptoms. You're going to see hypothalamic pituitary adrenal dysregulation. You start to get neuronal atrophy because cortisol actually bathes the brain and creates atrophy in the brain. And you'll see if patients with who have high levels of cortisol tend to have more of a kind of a shrunken brain. In fact, DHEA, I'll see in many patients and you'll see these high normal to high levels of DHEA. So that's a neurosteroid, and it's also made by the adrenal glands, and it's designed in part to help protect the brain from all that extra cortisol. So sometimes when we see male and female patients with these high levels of DHEA and go on to make more testosterone, sometimes that's actually a stress response because of trying to protect the brain from all that cortisol. And then inflammation. So why is there inflammation high? Because as cortisol becomes less effective in the body, one of its main jobs is to tamp down excess inflammation as part of the acute stress response. So when cortisol levels are high for too long, then you actually see more inflammation because cortisol isn't effective. And eventually, as this process continues, then cortisol starts to lower because the adrenal glands, which are mainly responsible for producing it, start to work less and less and less effective as it uses its nutrients to do the best job it can. For example, vitamin C is most highly concentrated in the body in the adrenal glands, and you'll see lower levels of vitamin C overall in the body. Okay. So Bruce McEwen in the 1990s at a McGill University came up with this idea of allostatic load. The mediators of the stress response contribute to allostatic overload, whereby the chemicals themselves will contribute to wear and tear on the body and cause longer-term damage. So allostatic load, the word allo and stasis. So allo meaning kind of similar and stasis meaning the same. He was coming up with this idea that the body made these chemicals, but over time, these chemicals, which were designed to help the body get out of a situation and a stress, actually starts breaking the body down. So he basically looked at Hans Selye's work. He didn't study with Selye, but he looked at his work and really carried it to the next level. And he came up with a number of different ways of looking at allostatic load to decide whether a particular person was in overload. And he would look at waist to hip circumference, a 12-hour norepinephrine, diastolic and systolic blood pressure, serum DHEA, which we just talked about, urinary cortisol, also changes in cholesterol, total cholesterol, good cholesterol, um, blood sugar regulation, and norepinephrine and epinephrine as well. So when we think about stress on the body, it's just not a person who's stressed out at the moment. It can also occur in the womb, right? In fact, there's even studies now about what they call transgenerational methylation, where actually that you can a person can actually have trauma, their grandparents can have trauma that actually gets passed down through generations, not through genetics. So the DNA doesn't change, but through epigenetics above the gene, meaning a relative that was very severely stressed out can make changes in their sperm and in their egg, in their methylation, like which is the way certain stress genes get expressed, and it could show up in generations to come. So that's a really interesting idea. And then more and more research now is really bearing that out. And then, of course, in the prenatal environment. So there's studies about the Dutch during World War II when the Nazis surrounded those areas, and they did a lot of research looking at people who were very stressed out during that time and seeing changes in newborns and offspring and those generations, and saw that when those people were in the womb and were very stressed out, there were clear changes in things like blood sugar regulation and blood pressure and mental health too. And then, of course, early life stress, which Rob spoke so well of, in the sense that when you're young, that is also when your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis gets set. Right. So in the womb, when you're young, that's when your brain is making decisions. Is this a safe world? Is this an unsafe world? And at what level do I need to be on guard and get anxious right away to save myself for survival? And a lot of this is mediated through the vagus nerve. And here's a picture of the vagus nerve from the 1500s. And we see the connection between the brain all the way to the body organs. It connects to the lungs, it connects to the heart, it connects um, intricately with the digestive system, and those body parts send signals back to the brain. Changes in the microbiome send signals back to the brain. And that's that bi-directional relationship that gets set up either early in life or in the womb, or I guess even before the womb, right? And then our ancestors. So adverse childhood experiences, uh, we look at a number of factors when we think about adverse childhood events. We look at physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and these are all scored to help decide at what level are these ACEs a probable part of why someone is having PTSD or trauma. Household dysfunction, intimate partner violence, household substance abuse, household mental illness, parental separation and divorce, incarcerated household members, and then neglect, physical neglect and emotional neglect. And I will say, if I had to pick one factor based on my 2 decades of seeing patients, I would say probably one of the more difficult ones to traverse, not impossible, but certainly more challenging, is when you work with someone who who just tells you the story of how they didn't feel loved as a child. I mean, that's a big one, and that certainly takes work, and it is traversable, but it's certainly really sets up the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis in a way that it's going to take a good amount of work to help move through that. Okay, so let's talk about health outcomes from chronic stress and trauma. So, talking about adverse childhood experiences, a higher disease burden, right? So, when you have higher level 3 plus, as we talked about earlier, had elevated risks across 17 health outcomes with particularly strong associations for depression, smoking, and coronary heart disease. And then in a meta-analysis of 25 studies, over almost 400,000 people saw these incremental impacts where every additional adverse childhood event contributed to a 12.9% increase in odds of developing two or more chronic diseases. And when you look at these studies on adverse childhood events, you see relationships even with longevity. There are studies, buccal studies, looking at children and adolescents, and even seeing uh, higher levels of telomere destruction, right? Telomeres, those with those little caps on molecular caps on DNA that protect DNA. So you even see it there. So you see early on in life how longevity is starting to decrease. So in Paris in 2023, they held the 31st European Congress on Psychiatry, and they found that psychiatric illness leads to both lower life expectancy in men, about 10 years, and in women, about 7 years. And they also talked about these increases in biomarkers that reflect increases in biological aging, so increases in interleukin 6, increases in alpha-synuclein, which is increased in things like Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's as well, increases in CRP, increases in blood pressure, increases in um, blood sugar, A1C, insulin. So all of these markers that suggest longevity issues, you'll see increased in people with psychiatric illness. The British Journal of Psychiatry from 2017, in regards to anxiety and lifespan, they saw clear cause of inflammation, things like CRP and interleukin 6 again, and immune dysfunction, where anxious individuals had an almost 40% greater risk of dying earlier than the general population. 40%. So when the body is in stress mode over the long term, it's just not healthy. And similarly, studies on depression, people are depressed 2.78 years older than their actual age, anxiety 2.91 years older than their actual age, and somatic symptoms. Every unit increase in somatic symptoms predicted brain age increase by 4.21 years. And these are pretty large studies. As far as post-traumatic stress disorder, we see increases in stroke, almost double, more than double stroke risk increase, 80%, 82% metabolic syndrome, almost 50% type 2 diabetes, 42% heart disease. So very consistent numbers among different studies as well. And interestingly, in 2001, when there was the World Trade Center first responders, they did studies of these people who did such amazing things during that time, and they found that the responders had brains of about 3.07 years older on average, while non-PTSD responders, so the people who kind of did the same amazing response and heroism, but didn't have PTSD, actually had a slightly younger brain age of negative 0.43 years. And I know Rob talked a little bit earlier about this idea of eustress, where you can have a stressor that actually kind of makes you healthier. It's almost like when you exercise, if you don't over exercise, you can build your muscles stronger, right? So this is what happens when we go through stress. If it's too much and it overloads us, then it hurts us. But if it's under that threshold, then it actually can make us stronger. Okay. And then I know in earlier lectures we talked about irritable bowel syndrome and mental health. So to continue that thought, when it comes to mental health and depression, individuals with depression were found to be approximately 31% more likely to have irritable bowel. With anxiety, 53% more likely. But when you think about the back and forth of it unidirectionally, having IBS did not necessarily increase the risk or cause stress, anxiety, or depression. So that's pretty interesting, because when you work with someone who has depression, anxiety, it's much more likely they're going to have irritable bowel, but not vice versa. When we think about chronic stress, a chronic stress experience in the past 5 years is significantly associated with self-reported IBS, about 40, almost 42% higher risk. And with post-traumatic stress disorder, a 2019 meta-analysis of almost 650,000 people found PTSD to be a significant risk factor for IBS. So certainly these mental health concerns will increase the risk of IBS, but not necessarily reverse. Back to you, Rob.
So Peter just made the case that chronic stress and specific experiences that are traumatic that lead to PTSD drive increased disease outcomes. That's part of the broader case we're making here to say that, again, chronic disease is to some extent predictable, and we have a framework for how we think about that. Now we want to spend some time to close talking about, to some extent, the antidote to that. And I would offer this idea that another cause of disease is disconnection. Disconnection from nature, disconnection from purpose, disconnection from people and our communities, people who know us and love us. And often I would add also disconnection from self, right? Not knowing ourselves and not loving ourselves. And so if we pass our life experiences through a lens of an environment that is supportive, frankly, we don't get traumatized. If we pass that lens, as Peter was saying, through a childhood that lacks support and understanding, through an adulthood that lacks meaningful connection and purpose, we absolutely have the opportunity to be traumatized, and that can increase risk of disease. And so last week, we talked about the physical environment when it comes to our ecology. Now we'll talk about the psychosocial environment. Again, nature, purpose, and community. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about connection to nature as an antidote to stress and trauma. There's a concept in Japan called Shinrin Yoku, translated to forest bathing. And what researchers found now for almost a decade is that we have direct reductions in inflammation, reductions in cortisol. Peter just spoke a lot about that. Obviously, as a corollary, reductions in blood pressure. As a result, improvements in our immune function, improved heart rate variability, and overall, we feel a greater sense of well-being when we're in nature. So, as much as you can make it a practice in your life, get out in nature and be there. We live in a very busy world. We wear stress as a badge of honor and busyness as a badge of honor. So I'm going to let you off the hook a little bit. Despite the fact that I've got a brick wall behind me, it's very clear in the literature that just seeing nature can get you part of the way there. There was a meta-analysis of 28 studies that clearly indicated improvements in psychological and physical well-being just having window views of nature. And if you think your life is stressful, and if you think it's impossible that you would benefit from that, we have to look to our most vulnerable populations, right? And prisoners, and especially those who have life sentences, tend to be our most vulnerable and impacted populations. And there's really fascinating data, multiple types of studies that show that when people are incarcerated, if they have a window that looks out at nature versus an urban setting, they do better, lower rates of violence in the prison, lower rates of depression, and yes, improved health outcomes just from having window views. And as you might imagine, there's nuance here. So not all views of nature are created equal. It turns out that tree canopy, compared to just general green space exposure, has a disproportionate effect on health outcomes. What they found in this fascinating study out of Australia was that every 1% increase in our visual field looking out a window of tree canopy reduced diabetes, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease in incremental ways. And there is a magic number here. Apparently, neighborhoods that had greater than 30% tree canopy had reductions in diabetes, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease on the order of 20 or 30% when compared to populations who had no exposure to tree canopy, all the way up to 9%, 9% still being insufficient. So as you're designing your homes, as you're thinking about, how to spend time in nature, try to make nature a part of your lives. And we might be so bold as to recommend that, you go out and hug a tree as your next prescription or your next support mechanism. It makes sense. The ecology of our lives isn't just something that exists here and now. It's something that we've evolved with, and our immune systems, and our nervous systems, and our endocrine systems evolved with and in symbiosis with our microbes. And last week, Medea made the case that that has a direct impact on health span. It also has a direct impact on how our body and our nervous system is primed. Reduced exposure in our modern worlds leads to immune dysfunction, leads to um, higher levels of inflammation, and as a result leads to chronic disease. Getting out of nature, playing in the dirt, hugging that tree absolutely is well validated in the literature to have an impact. Grounding, walking barefoot on the grass, grounding to nature, being connected to nature, again, very well validated to improve health outcomes, not just in terms of mental health, but cardiovascular disease, and rates of all kinds of other physical things that we'd be surprised to hear. Now, moving beyond connection to nature, we think about connection to purpose. Do we have something that feels bigger than us, broader than us, that we can connect to give our lives meaning? And the idea of purpose is something, again, that might sound kind of soft, subjective, something that really isn't at the highest level of clinical science. But if you actually look at the data, people who had connection to purpose in their lives had a 17% reduction in all-cause mortality and specifically cardiovascular events. You know, you've heard statistics probably that some of the most dangerous years of our lives are our first years and the year after we retire. If you really think about why that would matter, when adults go from having connection and feeling needed and feeling like they're playing a role in the world, and then they retire, there's interesting research that shows that 50% increases in cardiovascular disease and stroke happen in that first year after retirement. We have to find a way, if we aren't in our primary vocation, to still find meaning and purpose in our lives. Why is that? We'd make the case here and propose a mechanism that connection to purpose reduces that idea of allostasis or allostatic load that Peter expounded upon. That, by extension, reduces our psychological stress and our physical resilience, which has the capacity to change behavior, right? How we move, how we eat, how we sleep, going back to our very first conversation about lifestyle. Of course, changes in how we move and eat and sleep improves our health outcomes. And when we feel healthier and we feel vibrant, our opportunity to connect to purpose, to bring meaning to our communities and to our world goes up considerably. And so this becomes a virtuous cycle as opposed to a vicious cycle when we feel connected to purpose. And these aren't new ideas. When we look at ancient wisdom, when we look at practices like mindfulness and meditation, what's always discussed is the capacity to be here and now, to be present, as opposed to somewhere in the past, where frankly, what we're usually doing when we're overthinking about the past is regretting it, or some point in the future where we're growing to attached to a concept that might never come. And so every ancient practice that uses some sort of anchor, whether it's our breath or a thought pattern or a mantra, aims to take our minds, which frankly are just doing their jobs to keep us safe, and bring those minds back into the here and now. And guess what? It's really hard to do. But the truth is, and the research tells us that when we can be present in our bodies, when we can turn off the default mode network, that's the part of our brain. It's actually not one part, it's multiple parts that work together to try to keep us safe, to develop the narrative arc of our lives, to define the sort of self-referential processing, us versus time and space. When that default mode network is quiet, which happens when we're present in our bodies or present in work or present in something that's meaningful to us, health outcomes improve. And the most recent research around that is around flow states. And what people found, and one of my favorite studies, and this will date the study, but groups of individuals were given pagers and they were checked in with many times throughout the day over the course of several months. And the people who reported in the moment when they were paged that they were lost in work or lost in something that felt outside of themselves, they were happier, but they were also less likely down the line to develop chronic disease. And you see here those who are prone to flow, those who have the genetic, frankly, capacity for it, but also those who've cultivated that capacity, have a reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, stress-related disorders, and of course, mental health disorders like depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorder. So this is really, really important to think about how we connect to these things. Maslow tried to make the case, and the case, in many ways, was made for him in a way that he would have preferred that it not be made, almost as a ladder or a hierarchy. We call it Maslow's hierarchy, that the psychology textbooks took, and frankly, YouTubers took further. Um, Maslow never considered our core needs as a ladder or a step-by-step process. In fact, I have always liked this concept of the journey toward, the journey in the direction of self-actualization, love, connection, and belonging. And so, in a person who has their physiological needs met, and a person who has safety and shelter and food, they can start to begin to think about what we're talking about in terms of this antidote to trauma. That's not an option for everybody, right? There's a strong impact on how we grow up and the zip code within which we grow up, not just from an environmental standpoint, which is what we spoke about earlier with impacts on air quality and water quality, but also from a psychosocial standpoint. And so it's a blessing to be able to have conversations like this about our core needs. It's a blessing to move us in the direction of self-actualization, which different people can define in different ways. I would offer very succinctly, we feel self-actualized when our values and our actions have the capacity to align. And so this is what we're talking about when we talk about connection to purpose. And again, it's not a new concept. There's this concept of ikigai that's known in Japanese culture, quite literally translated to life value or life worth. Another translation being, reason for being or reason for waking up in the morning. This concept tries to marry four important concepts. In terms of our vacation, if we can find a way to do a combination of what we love, what we're uniquely capable and good at, what the world actually needs from us, and of course, we have to make a living, what we can be paid for, that intersection of connection to purpose and meaning has a direct impact on our health outcomes. There was a really fascinating study out of Japan that looked at around 43,000 people over 7 years, and they found a 50% lower risk of all-cause mortality in those who had ikigai. Again, think about the 50% study I mentioned in terms of that first year after retirement and risk of stroke and heart disease. These are huge numbers. If there was a pill, if there was a medication that can do that, we would all be on it very happily. And so, take as much stock in this idea as possible. It's easier said than done, right? Being connected to purpose and meaningful work is one of the rarest things in our modern world, unfortunately. So, if you're not there, do your best to check in with yourself about what matters most to you and move yourself in that direction. Now, this idea of supporting others being a core part of happiness is also very well established in the literature. This idea of doing unto others the way we want for ourselves is pretty clear. And I spent a lot of time working on the concept of social isolation and loneliness in medicine, and actually working with peers, people with lived experience who used that lived experience of their disease to connect with others who needed support. And what we were finding is the peers tended to get more benefit than the people that they were helping. And I was always curious about why that is. Of course, if someone is giving you help, it should be you that is receiving at least the majority of the benefit. And when you step back and think about the role of helping others and how that connects to our purpose, we have to break this down into, what does it look like to be well and to have well-being in our lives? We can broadly break this down into hedonic well-being. That's avoiding pain, seeking pleasure, or eudaimonic well-being. That's connection to purpose and meaning and people. It's everything we're talking about here. And if we break this down into four quadrants and we think about the direction of support, giving support versus taking support, far and away the best improvements in health happen for people who help others achieve their own purpose. So if you're lucky enough to be at the very top of the non-hierarchical hierarchy, use that as an opportunity to help others get there. Pull people up with you because it will directly impact your health. It'll extend and expand your lifespan. And if you're lucky enough to be in a place in your life where you can look forward and be excited about the aging process, which being in these sorts of positions offers, it has a direct impact on health outcomes. There was a recent study or set of studies that was published that looked at people's perceptions of their aging, if they projected out their aging towards the future. If we compare those people who feel excited about their lives and feel excited about what the next decades will bring once they retire from their primary vocation, we see again that it directly impacts health outcomes. In fact, the data shows us that being excited and thinking about aging in a graceful way improves and extends lifespan by about 7 years if we start in our middle decades, in our 50s and 60s. If we compare that to some of the pretty fascinating lifestyle studies, those usually max out at around 4 years. We presented the case that, lots of vigorous exercise gives you about 4 years of life. Super important. We can stack these things, but think about the connection and the potential impact of feeling connected to purpose and then helping others get all the way there with you. That is one part of the story when we talk about connection to community and to connection to other people. And so, like I said, I spent a lot of time fascinated by the role of isolation and perceived loneliness on health outcomes. And we find across the board that when people are more lonely, they're more likely to get sick. To what extent? Diabetes risk increases by more than 2 times when people feel lonely. That doesn't mean when they're alone. It means when they feel a lack of social connection and a disconnection between what they want and what they actually receive. Rates of heart disease, rates of stroke, rates of cancer, rates of dementia, all of those are directly impacted by feeling lonely or feeling alone. As we'll talk about in a moment, you don't need a lot of people in your life. You just need quality connections. Think about it. If you had surgery the next day, do you have someone you would call? That's really what we have to pay attention to. The idea, though, is that loneliness is not a maladaptive response. It's not something that's broken in us. In fact, we need to feel lonely because that's what keeps us safe. And there was a researcher named John Cacioppo out of the University of Chicago, and I followed his research for quite some time now. He's passed, but he had this fascinating proposal that actually the perception of loneliness was a highly selected polygenic trait that had the capacity to turn on the good genes and turn off the bad genes. Peter talked to you about epigenetics previously. Loneliness is not wrong if it moves us in the direction of community. In fact, if we didn't feel that, we wouldn't have evolved to be in community. And frankly, we evolved to be in community because that's where we're safe. It was far more dangerous in our evolutionary past to feel alone than to feel thirsty or hungry. And the idea that our biological mechanisms, that our physiology is always moving us in the direction of safety means it'll move us in the direction of people who we can connect with if we're fortunate enough to have just a few of those people in our lives. George Slavich proposed this idea of social safety theory, again, very well validated in the literature, that when we're lonely, it impacts health outcomes. Why might that be the case? When we experience a threat, when that bear is running at us that Peter proposed, we have to protect ourselves. We have to preserve our capacity for life, first and foremost, so that we can procreate, right? That's the idea of evolutionary biology. In that case, we become hypervigilant to our environments. That hypervigilance activates all the stress hormones and everything else. And frankly, it changes gene expression through that concept of epigenetics. It turns on inflammation. It turns on oxidative stress. It increases the likelihood of metabolic disorders. And perhaps worst of all, it changes how we see our environment. People who feel lonely are more likely to derive pleasure and joy from things than people. And then people who feel lonely are more likely to perceive neutral faces as negative compared to people who feel connected in community. And what does that do? Our world gets smaller and smaller. And again, it becomes a cycle that we are best inclined to avoid. So, as much as possible, when we think about chronic disease in our patients, if we can see that they're in community, if they feel supported, their likelihood of recovery is always considerably higher. What do we need in terms of support and this idea of quality versus quantity? Robin Dunbar, some of you may have heard of this idea of Dunbar's number at around 150 people. Dunbar actually studied um, apes, and what they found was, projecting to humans based on the size of our brains, our capacity for knowing and really knowing people and how they fit into our lives is that maxes out at about 150 people. Compare that to, modern day and social media and everything that it's done for how many people we think we know and we think we're connected to, but feel more lonely as a result of we're kind of living outside of our evolutionary biological context. But Dunbar also produced a paper in 2025 that talked about quality of relationships. What he defined as these core or intimate relationships, we need about five people. And frankly, if you've got two people, you're still above average. If those people are quality, meaningful connections, frankly, even one. When we go past that five, yes, it's good to have people who can protect us and keep us safe, that close circle of 15 people, but don't feel like you need hundreds of Facebook friends or you need thousands of Instagram followers to feel connected. In fact, it's the opposite. There is a inverse relationship with those things very often. So do your best to cultivate real relationships, quality relationships, and that will have an impact on your health outcomes. So we're 3 weeks and three conversations in, and I hope that we've made the case here that, again, chronic disease develops as a result of very predictable variables. And if you remember nothing else, remember this: chronic disease develops when our body's core needs are not met and our personal capacity for self-preservation and healing is exceeded by our circumstances. We've presented different versions of examples through lifestyle medicine, environmental medicine, mind-body exposure to make that case, right? Those circumstances might vary, and we have unique genetics that tell us we need unique experiences, and our biologies are very unique. But as a rule of thumb, if we consider our core needs, giving the body what it needs, and avoiding obstacles to healing, we have an opportunity to really prevent chronic disease. That chronic disease prevention model is very different from what people are hoping for with longevity and anti-aging tools, right? Those things we mentioned on the very first conversation, repurposed drugs and fancy supplements and red light therapies and plasma exchanges and peptides, maybe they have an impact on our biology, but they'll never replace our core needs. They'll never replace the fact that we need to be connected to community. We need nourishment. We need to make sure we avoid all kinds of man-made exposures and on and on and on. So we've made that case today, and we propose a different way that medicine should function. We propose that there are, frankly, two paths. There's the path of early detection and intervention, making sure that we're doing thorough imaging and doing all kinds of blood tests. And then there's the path of identifying the modifiable determinants of health. We proposed many here, and that the combination of those things is what we use to develop a comprehensive care plan. We need to motivate sustainable behavioral change. Otherwise, it's just something on paper or on a screen. But if we can accomplish that, and if we thoroughly address those determinants of health, and if we treat what we find and what we identify in terms of early detection, and we continue to come back to that body and see how it's responding to those things, then we're doing something really special. The idea of longevity is not, the absence of disease. It's living connected to ourselves and our communities and our bodies. So, with that, we thank you for listening, and open to any questions that you might have. So let's see. Okay, we've got a couple here, and I think we've got a little bit of time. So, what does incorporating biography into care for a patient look like? How should clinicians start that conversation? That's a great question because it's not an easy conversation, right? Especially because when most people go to the doctor, they're not expecting to talk about their feelings and how much support they have in their lives and their childhood and their upbringing. And so because the system is such that they haven't really been primed to talk to their doctors that way, they're less likely to bring it up. So we have to bring it up, whether that's on a paper intake form or through a conversation. By the way, one of the best ways to start that conversation is around stress. I said earlier, people wear stress kind of as a badge of courage or a badge of honor, or busyness as a corollary to that. People will talk about their stress, but when they talk about their stress being family, there's an opportunity, right? Ask more questions, ask a follow-up. If they talk about their stress being work, ask a follow-up about if they enjoy their work, if they feel connected to their coworkers and what they do. If they feel like they have mastery over their work, that's another important concept. So stress is a good way in. But every case is different, and it just sort of requires a felt sense around what's this person willing to share. And it might not be right away. It might be over the course of months and years that we actually broach those conversations. Because again, people come in with the idea of a physical symptom when they go to the doctor. This is different than if someone goes to a behavioral health provider or a therapist or a psychiatrist. Um, and what I often found was that physical symptom is a way in. If you can make the case, which we're trying to make here, that the body speaks to us through our physical symptoms. We've been giving this example of IBS throughout this series. If we make the case that our body speaks through our digestive system, that's understandable to people because they say, look, I'm doing everything I can and my gut still feels wrong. But when I'm anxious, my digestion is worse. Aha, there's the way in, there's the connection. So you have to kind of meet people where they're at. What evidence-based interventions or practices can individuals incorporate into their daily lives to mitigate the long-term negative outcome of adverse childhood experiences? I think it's everything that we talked about in the second half of this presentation, right? It's surrounding ourselves with community. It's being connected to purpose, it's being in nature. All these things really matter in a systematized way, right? If you've been through trauma and you now establish and agree with this idea that that has an impact on health outcomes, if we want to be preventative, we want to go through a sort of systematic process. And I would offer there are two parallel, both of which are important paths. There's this idea of talk therapy, CBT, ACT, dialectical behavior therapy, whatever you're doing, there's incredible value in drawing a linear line, right? And helping our body to understand and our brain to understand what the pattern was, what the circumstances were that led from A to B to C. However, we've established here that when we've been traumatized, our body doesn't really speak in a linear way. And in fact, what we're trying to do sometimes is bring language to a symptom conversation. And so there's a whole nother path of mental health provider that looks at somatic experiences. And there's a whole world of somatic therapies, and there are many of them. Somatic experiencing was Peter Levine's work that we mentioned. Internal family systems is a similar approach. EMDR has a strong somatic component. But then there's also really interesting research. Bessel van der Kolk writes in his book about the role of yoga. The bottom line is we have to learn to be in our bodies as much as possible, right? That's very different from saying this thing happened to me and this is how I feel about it. What we have to learn and frankly teach people to do is track sensation. I propose that framework that happens over seconds or years. We have to learn to notice what our body is telling us in the moment. And this interesting paradox happens, and anyone who's treated anxiety will see this. The worst thing we can do with anxiety and stress and trauma is turn away from it because this is just an alarm, right? An alarm is yelling at us and speaking and saying, listen to me, something feels misaligned, something feels wrong. Um, the paradox with anxiety is the only way out of it, you've heard this phrase, is through it. It's the same thing with work around trauma. You have to find a way to be with your physical sensations in the maximum tolerable dose, no more, no less, so that your body can understand that it can be with that and also be safe back in that here and now. So, next question is, so we live in a society in a world where we are encouraged to accumulate and acquire. Health is one of those acquisitions, but when does the goal of acquisition become damaging and when can enough be the healthy goal and balance? How do we figure we have reached the state of enough food, exercise, money, success, health? That is a fascinating question that, we should all spend, many more hours on together. The first thing that comes to mind, is this idea of enough food. We spent a lot of time in the beginning talking about caloric restriction and health span and lifespan extension. There's really interesting data that, and actually this comes out of Japan too, that when people stop eating when they feel about 80% full, it actually turns on repair mechanisms. Um, we also planned to talk, but frankly ran out of time about the role of our digital environments, right? This constant onslaught of notification and false connection and this idea that we always need to be on, we always need to be searching for more. It's a really dangerous concept. The one of the more interesting studies I ever read around finances is the fact that when somebody wins the lottery, the chance that their neighbor goes bankrupt skyrockets. Why might that be, right? We're always comparing ourselves to others. We're always keeping up with the Joneses. So why would it increase our chance of bankruptcy? It's because if someone around us feels like they have a lot we try to get there. But the truth is there's always going to be someone who has more than us. Financially, in terms of connection and love and spiritual evolution, the best thing we can do is be fully ourselves and meet others in mutual wholeness, I would say. And that's a great concept for relationships as well, which can be a different conversation. I think we have time for one more question. The chronic disease progression model reframes physical symptoms as evidence of repair mechanisms being activated. How can clinicians communicate this without minimizing patient suffering? That's a wonderful question. And in fact, I think it's an empowering idea. I think it's an empowering idea to be told that our body is trying to protect us. It's not so much that something is broken or wrong. It's not so much that we can't move beyond that circumstance. But it is empowering to know that there is a way through it, that there is a predictable way through it. And that's not always easy. And in fact, often it's very hard and feels near impossible depending on what we're dealing with. But my perspective has always been if people can feel like um, their body is moving them in the direction of healing, without minimizing, yes, you have severe pain, but here's the reason for it. It gives them a little bit more meaning around what's happening, and it opens a window of opportunity for behavioral change, frankly, for self-love. One of the worst things we can do, I mentioned earlier around anxiety, one of the worst things we can do is turn against ourselves. Our body is doing its best to keep us healthy. As we established earlier, it's often maladaptive. Working in partnership with that it's pretty well established to be helpful. We have stories around remarkable recoveries, and almost always people feel that they've embraced their disease as opposed to fighting against it, right? This idea of being attached to a concept and fighting what is. Again, ancient wisdoms comes through here. When we feel connected to our bodies and we understand that our bodies are just doing their best, just like other people in our lives, we're far more likely to experience healing. So um, thank you for listening to that. That we really feel strongly about this conversation. We feel frankly honored to get to have it with all of you. And so this has been the origins of chronic disease and integrative health perspective, and we can't wait to have more conversations with you.